I'm primarily an audiovisual artist, and I work with places and communities to try and, in some way, represent them, represent their stories, and bring people together through that process. I work with film and sound and projection a lot in site-specific contexts, often in public space, and often they form quite immersive installations and multi-sensory in different ways. I think instinctively, the place where everyone comes together, where you encounter all types of people, where your culture and your society is represented, it all happens in public space. I like always being in those environments, observing those environments, and I think for me, it just feels like the place that I want to make work. From my personal point of view, what I get from these projects is that sense of connection to a group of people, groups of people, and places which I'm always fascinated by, always wanting to meet different people and see the kind of different ways people live, experience the world. So that's certainly why I get a lot from these projects. And my hope is through the process of doing them, people feel more connected to each other and the place that they live. I think it's much talked about how we live in quite an individualized world and how technology kind of has further enhanced that feeling. And I think the role of art in that context, or public art, is to kind of allow people to have those kind of real world connections to their physical surroundings and the people around them, and to have that kind of emotional support, which I think very much came to the forefront in COVID, where we lost that, but we also somehow built those connections and relied on those connections more than ever. And I think it really showed the value of this, of that kind of work of creating those connections and experiences that are shared. I'd done some of this kind of what I'd call sort of community embedded work before COVID, but not much. It was much more, the work before then was much more interactive. It was much more experiential, I would say. And what I found since COVID is that way of working, of being embedded in a community and making it much more about connection, seems to have really grown, and that people seem to want that more. And I'm finding myself doing more of that kind of work, which I'm really enjoying. And I don't know if that's a coincidence, but yeah, it seems like that has had an effect on how we think about this kind of work and the need for that. Navvies was born out of a desire to tell the story of the 16,000 odd labourers who dug the Manchester Ship Canal, which is where Salford Quays is now, in Media City, where the project was based. So the project was ultimately a light installation in the canal itself as part of Light Waves Festival, and that installation was of disembodied spades, barrows, pickaxes moving under the water to pay homage to the anonymous labour force that dug this canal and mark that contribution on the site. A key part of the project was how telling this story of the navvies could help connect the site, Salford Quays, to other communities in Salford, many of whom would have worked on the docks, or their ancestors would. Some maybe have even dug the canal. So we worked with a local community group called Salford Loaves and Fishes. And through a series of workshops and different activities, including working with the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra, we sort of talked about the Navvies story, what it means today, and built up this community around the project. And the outcome of that was a community garden that's now in the heart of Media City, which is sort of co-owned by Loaves and Fishes. And the digging of that garden itself was filmed, and that's what became the light installation, the sort of memorial to these labourers. So the community today taking the place of that labour 100 plus years ago. I think ever since I heard of the Navvies story from a friend in Manchester, I was first in awe of the scale of it. I just couldn't believe something of that magnitude had happened. But then my experience of being on the site, Salford Quays, it then really felt like this story, a story of that magnitude and the amount of labor and sacrifice that went into that. There were many deaths, should be marked significantly. And that story has a lot of relevance today and a lot of power to connect to today's communities and form some kind of greater, longer lasting bond between the site here today and those communities and everybody whose ancestors would have been involved in that project, which was vast and humbling. I think one reason it's important to highlight contributions like that, even if they're quite historic, is there's this debate around representation in public space, who we're memorializing and why. And I think there is a movement now to try and really mark those who have contributed in ways, but at the time were repressed or even discriminated against, and to really now memorialize publicly and celebrate their contribution. And I think that's really important. And this story of the Navvies in Salford is one that is repeated across the country, across the world. So I think that's a really important aspect. Another reason I think it's important to talk about the Navvies story today is that it's not a historic story. When we were opening Navvies in December, the Qatar World Cup was ongoing, where there are some figures put deaths there at 10,000, which dwarfs the number of Navvies killed even 100 plus years ago. So these labor struggles are happening all over the world, where we're sort of saying, what is the value of human life and what is the value of labor in light of these big monumental projects, such as the Industrial Revolution in Manchester, which brought all of the success to the area, but came at a great cost. And I think that debate will never end, and I think it's important to have it. The starting point of who we involved in this project from the community point of view was, I suppose, what are we digging and why? We knew we wanted to include digging as the thing that's projected into the canal. And my thought was that people should be digging to, in some way, heal or regenerate the land in some way through, in this case, a garden. And so the question became, well, who is digging that? And who has relevance and who would find meaning in the story of the Navvies? And to us, that felt like people that maybe feel personally disenfranchised within their community, sometimes on the outside of it. And in the same way, the Navvies were also in some ways ostracized from the wider community. So Salford Loaves and Fishes support many different people in a lot of different circumstances, including homeless people, people out of work for various reasons, but ultimately people who want community connection. So when we went to them, they were hugely supportive and excited, and it just felt immediately like this was a group of people to work with. And they were also really excited about the idea of creating something and then looking after it into the future, which they are. I think with this project, it felt like the Navvies story was a huge opportunity to involve people from the wider Salford community and help build or rebuild a connection to the Salford Quays site, Media City site, which is a huge development, but isn't necessarily representative or considered for all communities in Salford. Or at least that was a perception. And this felt like a really good opportunity to, I suppose, use this story and think about that and have it as an opportunity to create that connection with the community through working with Salford Loaves and Fishes. Navvies was certainly the project where I've worked with the largest number of people and volunteers, and I learned a lot through that. The amount of emotional investment that goes into a project like that, which is also what made it beautiful. But so I carry that forward now into my way of working, of feeling like I want to involve more people, because ultimately that's what will allow the work to do a better job of representing its place in its community I suppose my role is more a kind of almost producer, or to hold it all together with a concept and idea, but also then let it happen with people feeling enfranchised by the work. That's what I learned in Navvies. In making public art, you're often invited to a place to form a representation of it, and I think it's really hard to do that without the participation of those who live there, who know it, who know its stories, who know its intricacies, and know each other. So I think ultimately, the process of making a project like this is one of embedding yourself in a place and a community there, building trust, which works both ways. And then through that participation, as the project sort of naturally evolves, and then whatever comes out of it feels like somehow a truer representation of the place, the people that you're making work about. The Lightwaves Festival has a huge public audience, hundreds of thousands of people that aren't necessarily typical art-going audiences. It's all free, and people come along and explore it with a kind of open mind. So that's why it's amazing to have work in that context. I think that light festivals have sort of become the folk art festivals of our age, really. They're light, sound, people like taking pictures of them, but it's something that people can share easily with one another. And I think to be part of that context is the most kind of public art context you can be presenting work. At the same time, I think it presents a lot of challenges, because with a project like Navvies, which has quite a lot of depth to it and a lot of components, you can't expect to do that with an audience which is as broad as that. There will be some that will hopefully get a great deal of depth and meaning from that project, but you have to accept that that won't necessarily be the experience of an awful lot of people there, and that's part of the deal, I think. On previous projects, I've worked with musicians, often recording in really interesting site-specific ways. But this was the first time making music, again, with a community group, and also with so many musicians in an orchestra, and also of relinquishing so much control, essentially, over to everyone involved in that process. I'm not a musician myself, but I would also often, I suppose, you end up wanting to have quite a lot of oversight in what's happening and how the music's being made and things like that. But it really was bring these people together and kind of see what happens. You've set up the circumstances, and it was really amazing to see what came out of that. My highlight of making Navvies was definitely the opening night, when we were all gathered in the Lowry, and basically everyone that was involved in this project, the team that supported it, Mark, my producer, Mediale, and then importantly, the entire community group, everyone came along, and it felt like quite raucous, actually. It was amazing.
It was.
And it was incredibly emotional. So yeah, that felt like that is the project. What has formed around this, that felt like the project in that moment.